You want to first pay attention to what your numbers look like. I have 2 minus 4i and 1 plus 3i. Notice there is a real part and an imaginary part, which makes it a complex number. These work a lot the same as when you are finding the answers to polynomials, like 2 plus 4x, 2 minus 4x, and 1 plus 3x. We can add i's with i's and real numbers with real numbers, and that's about how you go about it. So if I want to do z plus w, I would just write down z, 2 minus 4i, plus w, 1 plus 3i. I'm not going to worry about parentheses here because it was addition. And we just combine the real parts. 2 plus 1 gives me 3. And the imaginary part, negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1i. Or you can just write that as 3 minus i. Okay? If we want to do z minus w, we need to be a little careful because of that negative sign. So I have my z, again, was 2 minus 4i, minus, I'm going to put this in parentheses here, 1 plus 3i. The reason I put that in parentheses is because I'm subtracting that whole quantity, so I have to distribute the negative to both parts. So my problem now is 2 minus 4i minus 1 minus 3i. Again, you just combine the real part. 2 minus 1 is 1, and combine the imaginary part. Negative 4 and a negative 3 gives me a negative 7i. And there's my solution. Here's this last one, z times w. This is, again, very similar to polynomials. When we have polynomials with two terms, remember that we FOIL those. I need to take everything in the first set times everything in the second set. So I would take the 2 times the 1 is 2. And 2 times 3i, 2 times 3 is 6i. And then I move on to the negative 4i and multiply it times everything in that second in w. Negative 4i times 1 is a negative 4i. And negative 4i times 3i is negative 12i squared. Now we have to do some simplifying here because we have a couple of different things we can simplify. I have my 6i minus 4i. Those are like terms. 6 minus 4 gives me positive 2. And then remember, I squared is negative 1. So this here is negative 12 times negative 1, which is a positive 12. Now, my final step here, I have 2 and 12 that can be added together. So my answer is 14 plus 2i. Okay, so just go one step at a time. You ought to be okay. Here's a couple more that are a little more complex. You need to be really careful on this one that says z squared. I have a new z and a new w. Remember, please, that squared means times itself and not that you just square each thing inside. Okay, so z is negative 1 plus 2i. Z squared would mean negative 1 plus 2i times itself. Negative 1 plus 2i. And we have to kind of FOIL that out. So I take the negative 1 times everything. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 times 2i is a negative 2i. Then I go to the 2i and multiply it. 2i times negative 1 is negative 2i. And 2i times 2i is 4i squared. Now all we have to do is go ahead and simplify. So I have 1 minus 4i. I combine my i's. And then remember the I squared is negative 1. So 4 times negative 1 would give me a negative 4 here. And I just now put my real numbers together. 1 minus 4 gives me negative 3 minus 4i as my answer. Okay? Alright, this other one is going to take a lot more room from me. It wants z times w minus w times z. So I am going to try to have enough room to do this. Z times w. And you may see a pattern here, okay? And w times z. Now I'm going to do these one at a time, okay? Again, we have to kind of FOIL that out. So negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. Negative 1 times negative I is positive 1I. 2I times 3 is 6I. And 2I times negative I is a negative 2I squared. That's my quantity over here. If I simplify that, I get negative 3 plus 7I. And recall that negative 2I squared is negative 1. So I have negative 2 times negative 1 is positive 2. And finally down here I have negative 1 when I put negative 3 and 2 together, plus 7I. Now let's do the W times Z. You may have a theory about what's going to happen here. Let's see if it actually happens. 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. 3 times 2I is 6I. Then I go to the negative I times negative 1 is a positive I. And negative I times 2 is, whoops, wrong sign there. Let me fix that. Is a negative 2I squared. Okay, remember we're subtracting here in the middle. Subtracting. If I simplify that, I have a negative 3 plus 7I, and again, negative 2I squared is negative 1. So negative 2 times negative 1 is a positive 2. Combine my like terms of negative 3 and 2, and I get negative 1 plus 7I. Notice they were exactly the same thing, which means multiplication of complex numbers is probably commutative. And I can change directions. So now we've finished this up here. I'm subtracting. So I have negative 1 plus 7I plus 1 minus 7I. Everything cancels, and I get 0 as my answer. So there are some demonstrations of adding and multiplying complex numbers.